tackling tough topics to help you think reasonably about life's most important issues. This is Thinker Sensitive.
This is Chad Graham with Thinker Sensitive on the rise of socialism. I'm here with Ben Crenshaw, my co-host, and Nicholas Mashanya for this episode on what is private property. Guys, thanks for being here this morning.
Thank you, Chad.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so as we talk about socialism, a recurring theme that has to be defined, kind of parameters given, is this idea of private property. And so, Ben, why don't you start us out with giving a good definition of what private property is and talk to us a little bit about what it means philosophically.
Absolutely. Property is a huge issue. And we can talk about private property. Socialists talk about collective property. And so let's just think about property for a second. What is property? And I want to kind of give two tales here. You have what I think is a really solid understanding from a biblical and Christian theological perspective, and then maybe you have more of a atheistic socialist or a Christian socialist view. So when we think about property, we think about God's creation of everything. It was through the act of creating the world that God was able to say, "This is mine." So it was the action, the ability to create, this creative power that gave him the right to say, what I created is mine.
It entailed ownership.
It entails ownership. Now, what did God do when he created humans? He created them in his image, which means we were created to be creators. And so we have co-creative powers with God. We are able to create things. Now, we don't create things ex nihilo, out of nothing, the way God does. We have categorically, our nature and power is the same as God, but it's often different in dimension or degree. So God can do things beyond what we can do. But we have it's a parallel to being created in his image. So we create things that didn't exist before. We do it with material goods that are already there. But it's through that creative power that we're able to say, this is mine. And it's not, when we talk about creation, we often think about like, I'm going to go to the woods. I'm going to cut down a tree. I'm going to take this tree. I'm going to work with it in my hands and create this piece of woodcraft, chair, table, whatever it may be. But it could be something as simple as coming up with an idea.
Yeah.
That idea is yours. It's not someone else's, and it's yours because it came from you and not someone else. And that's the idea of intellectual property. And if you borrow an idea from someone else and you don't give them credit, it's intellectual theft.
Yes.
So on one version of this, we have the idea that there is a measure in which we are co-creators with God. Now, there's also a sense in which, when you read John Locke, you'll find that we own ourselves to a degree. Now, it's not true if you read Locke that he believed that we are complete masters of our own fate or something like that. Locke was a theist. He believed in God, but he believed that God had given us our bodies as a form of entrusting or stewardship. We are given our bodies to own.
A unique relationship between us and God.
Yes,
in
exactly.
That ownership.
And when we take our bodies and we mix our labor with the earth as free people with moral agency, the product of that labor becomes ours. Now, it doesn't mean that the stewardship we have before God, the responsibility we have before God to use that property well, is diminished or abdicated. It's not like we are radically free to just do whatever we want without any kind of oversight or responsibility or accountability. But it's ours in the sense that no one else has claim to it. We do. And it's between us and God. That's kind of that's storyline one. Storyline two would be, first of all, an atheistic view that says that, property is basically a theft. You just take it by force because it's there in nature and you're a part of nature. And if you can overcome somebody else, take what no one has claimed, then it's yours as long as you have enough power to obtain it and to maintain it.
Or even in a less maybe scrupulous or villainous term, you're taking of the land that you occupy, right? You're not necessarily taking from somebody else all the time. You come upon a plot of land as you're making your way west in the expansion of America, and you say, this hill is mine, right?
Exactly.
And that's taking something from the land, right?
Exactly. Now, there's a version of Christian socialism where they'll say, well, God created the world and all the resources in the world to be shared equitably, to be used generously among all people. So the claim to private property and you being able to decide what you're going to do with that property is a violation of this kind of like created mandate, this cultural mandate and order that God has out there. Or they'll say you don't really own yourself. God owns you, and therefore somehow that leads to the conclusion that you don't really own your property and others have a claim to it or something like that.
But then what about the stewardship that God gives us over things? How does that play into ownership?
Yeah, well, they'll say, Christian socialists will say part of the mandate of stewardship is that you basically strive for socialist outcomes.
Yeah.
So they'll kind of work in stewardship within a Christian socialist perspective.
They say things like God requires us to use our wealth and our means in such a way that we redistribute that equally.
Right.
Because it's all of ours. Ours is the earth, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
that idea. Now, technically, socialists don't believe in private property. Now, Marx did to a degree. So we want to say that Marx believed in the abdication of private property or something like that. No, he believed in private property. But
He did see it as an enemy.
yeah.
He
Yes,
says that multiple
it was.
times.
And part of the reason why socialists believe that property is an enemy is because they see it abused all the time. It's a means of power, of domination of others, of exploitation, of creation of massive amounts of wealth that are then inequitably distributed within society and so forth. So they're against, in a lot of ways, they're against private property because of the practical consequences of it. And so they'll propose this idea of collective ownership of property. So this idea of collective ownership. Now, I don't think that works, and here's why. It doesn't work because what does it mean to own something? To own something means to have a final authority over its use. So it's to be able to say, this is how this thing ought to be put to use.
Yes.
And once you reach a certain critical mass of people, you would have to have 100% consensus among all those people on exactly how this piece of property is going to be used in order to say that they all own it.
Right.
If you have 100 people
And only 99 of them.
and 99 of them want to use national defense in a just war theory way, only
Yeah.
as to defend themselves against aggressors, and one person wants to use national defense to be an aggressor and land the first blow. Well, if the 99, because of their majority, overcome the minority, then that one person doesn't actually own it, doesn't own national defense. So you could do this for anything.
Right.
So really, the problem is that you can't use something as a collective unless there's 100% agreement or consensus. And that, beyond like, say, two people, a married couple, or a family, but even in a family, the children don't have a say-so over how the minivan's going to be driven today.
Yeah.
It's like there's a breakdown.
Though they try.
Yeah. And so there's conceptual problems with this idea of collective ownership. And what does it do then? It collapses into ownership by the elite,
Yes.
by the government. And so it excludes the masses of people under socialism, don't really own the goods and services in society. The government does, and they make unilateral decisions.
So how important is private property to a market? I mean, can a market really truly function if we don't have at least a rudimentary understanding in law and practice of private property?
Yeah. Private property is critical. It's one of the foundations for any market economy, and this is because what are markets? Markets are the exchange of goods and services, the free and voluntary exchange of goods and services among willing participants. And then you need prices and you need property rights for that to work. If I don't have the right to the money that I've earned through my work, then I can't use that money to buy a good or service. And if the person who created that good or service doesn't have the right to sell it, and then the right to own the money that I pay them for it, then all economic transactions break down.
They become de-incentivized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's really interesting is that Hernando de Soto, he talks about how private property is critical for any kind of wealth creation in second and third world countries, and how this is like the mechanism. This is the key. The mystery of capital. That's what it's called.
Right, yes.
The mystery of capital. The mystery of capital is that you need private property rights in order to have any kind of prosperity. And so for in part of what the rule of law does within market economies is they protect property rights. And what are contracts? Contracts are the protection of property rights, of human rights. Like if I contract with you to rent a space and you're going to take it for this much money and so forth, those are property rights. I have the right to that property as long as I'm paying you this rent.
Right.
But you retain some absolute rights in terms of you own the property and you have certain duties and responsibilities for that property and so forth.
Right.
So rule of law, exchange, prosperity, trade, investment, all of these things that the market does well depends upon private property.
Yeah, and I can think of some examples of how bringing private property into a market really invigorates it, like when we think about some of the early settlements in America.
Absolutely. Yeah, you can look at Jamestown and Plymouth Colony. And in Jamestown, both of these places, Jamestown was founded in 1607 and Plymouth Colony in 1620. And both of these places experimented with socialism for a time. And what happened in Jamestown was that, in one sense, Jamestown is a really funny example because they were
And everybody died. It wasn't a good.
Yeah, I know, it wasn't funny. But it's a fascinating historical example because it was founded as an economic colony sponsored by a joint stock company in Great Britain. And so the whole idea was you were going to take these merchants and these traders and these people, these entrepreneurs, and you're going to put them in America, and they're going to go to work, and they're going to create prosperity. Well, the plant that they found to create prosperity was a cash crop, tobacco. They were growing so much tobacco, they were growing it in their cornfields, and they forgot to grow food.
Yeah.
And they were starting to starve.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so there was in one sense, there was like a perverse profit incentive there.
Yeah.
But what happened was the authorities tried to manipulate and coerce through public whippings to make people grow corn.
Yeah.
And it didn't work. It collapsed.
Right.
So there had to be an incentive to plant corn in proportion to tobacco in some ways so that you could live and sell your goods and so forth. In Plymouth Colony, they actually made a charter, a contract at the beginning where they were going to hold everything in common, the kind of idea. There was going to be this, they called it a common magazine.
It actually paid your way over. Like a lot of people didn't have the economic funds to go on this voyage, and so they consigned their labor in order to get passage to this new bountiful land. And when they got there, they were adverse to take any risk because they didn't own the property they were tending to and cultivating.
Yes, absolutely. And so they tried this, and it had disastrous effects on work ethic and productivity. And they were already facing tremendous obstacles in terms of adjusting to a new hostile environment, relationships with the Indians. It was cold in winter. Half the people died in the first winter. Tuberculosis, cholera, all those kinds of things. And so what William Bradford did was he implemented this idea that families would be given a parcel of land and they would work it.
Yeah.
And they would produce their own goods from that land, and then they would transact with others. And that is what essentially helped Plymouth Colony survive.
It incentivizes
economically.
And that is not something I learned in school.
Yeah, absolutely.
We tried. So what you're saying, Ben, is that we tried socialism, it failed, and people died because of it. And so
America,
we made a radical change to personal property, personal responsibility, and that led to flourishing.
Well, yeah, that's a real simple timeline. But of course, there was a lot that happened between 1607 or 1620 and the founding of America in 1787, and so. There was the Enlightenment and all kinds of ideals and so forth, and different colonies tried different things. But yeah, from the beginning there was a respect of property and human rights and free exchange of ideas. And of course that goes back to the Charter of Englishmen and the Glorious Revolution and the Magna Carta and so forth, because all the colonists were English men and women. And so there was a great history there as well.
Ben, thank you so much for being on the show today, co-hosting with me. Nicholas, thanks for being here. This is Thinker Sensitive, The Rise of Socialism. We're about to tackle what is labor and what is class next. Stay tuned at thinkersensitive.com.
For more Thinker Sensitive content, visit thinkersensitive.com. Be sure to find us on iTunes and YouTube as well.